Our reading this morning is by Rosamond S. King, and it is called Do Not Trust the Eraser. Do not trust the eraser. Prefer crossed out, scribbled over monuments to something once thought correct. Instead, colors, transparencies, track changes, versions, iterations. How else might you return after discards, attempts, and mistakes to your original genius? Our theme this month, and certainly this morning, is trust. And I wanted to open my sermon telling you a story about a time I experienced both a lack of and an abundance of trust. This particular story, I found myself on a boat looking out over a beautiful and slightly agitated ocean. My future spouse at that time, Alex, and I were visiting their parents who were living in Tahiti at the time. And we were on this boat in this beautiful, agitated ocean, theoretically to swim with humpback whales. And I say theoretically because at the moment we enter this story, I was feeling very uncertain about that plan. I have always loved whales of many kinds, and when my in-laws pitched the idea of swimming with them, I was there for it. I had visions of floating next to gentle giants in this calm, still, lagoon-like ocean of clear water. And in my imagination, the whales and I were just chilling there together, just me and them, two different species in communion. And in the moment on that boat, things were very different. The currents were strong that day, whipped up by winds, so that waves were rocking and rolling the boat. Our feisty guide and most of the other people on the boat spoke French as their primary language, and so we were given very rapid instructions about what to do in a language that I did not understand. And Alex translated for me and said, "Yesterday the whales were sleeping and very calm, and let people hang out with them for hours. But they're very active today. He says that when he gives the word, we need to jump in and swim fast." Jump in and swim fast. I've never been a very strong swimmer, and those words did not go down easy with me. I began to feel unsettled, a sense deep down in my gut that jumping in and swimming fast was not the direction I should take my life. "I'm not sure I'm up to this," I said to no one in particular, and so no one in particular paid any attention. "The current seems strong," I suggested, but everybody else seemed to think it was just fine. So when the moment came and the word was given, I hauled my whole self, snorkel, goggles, flippers and all, into the water. I was immediately overwhelmed. Face down in that water, I couldn't make out anything through my goggles. The sea was a dark, swirling abyss beneath me. My flippers seemed to weigh down my feet, making every kick a struggle. The waves crashed through the top of my snorkel and pushed me down and buffeted me. It almost felt like being punched over and over again. The whales, not in the mood to be observed, had apparently booked it towards the horizon. And try as I might to make progress against the current, I couldn't. And soon it became difficult for me to stay above the waves at all. And in that moment, it occurred to me that a life jacket would be a really useful thing to have. I didn't have one. And I began to feel truly afraid because I was profoundly aware of how outmatched I was by the forces of nature against my own tiny human body. And I wondered why I hadn't trusted my own instincts to stay on the boat. I wondered if I could trust my body to get me back to the boat. And then I became aware that Alex had come up next to me. I don't remember the exact words that were exchanged, but I know they asked me how I was doing, and I told them, I don't think I can make it back to the boat. In that moment, I was overcome by the ocean. But the broader context of that moment was that it arrived at a time in my life when I was overcome by the world in many ways. And in that state, I told Alex something that felt logical to me in that frame of mind. I said, you don't need to wait for me. You can leave me and you can go after the whales and just let me do this alone. And they said, no, absolutely not. We are going to get back to that boat together. And we did. Now, the details of how we managed it are a blur to me. You can ask them after the service. But what I do remember is surrendering to a sudden feeling of trust. Trust in the pace we were moving together. Trust in Alex to help me get back to that boat. And trust in them when they told me, we are going to make it. Now, we're both here with you today, so you can guess that the story ended well. We made it back. I stayed on the boat for the remainder of the outing, and the whales, who never did slow down, eventually did grace us with their presence by swimming alongside the boat, breaching and slapping the water with their fins and showing us their exhales. Oh. I don't know about all of you, but for me, existing these days can feel all too similar to being on that boat again and in that water. The waters of our society are choppy right now, to say the least. The waves of unchecked late-stage capitalism that values profits over people are more than rocking the boat. The winds of authoritarianism are blowing at gale force. And some of the people on the boat seem ready to embrace the wind and the waves. In fact, maybe they have. They've jumped right in and made a home in all of it. Others seem content to ignore the warning signs, focusing instead on their imagined ideal boat ride, rather than the reality that it has shaped up to be. And some of this are witnessing all of this unfold with more than a sense of mistrust in our guts, I think. It's mistrust writ large right now. Times are troubling and frightening. And fear is a great friend of mistrust. When we're afraid, we begin to deeply question whether we can trust our public institutions, our communities, our very neighbors. We wonder who and what can we possibly trust if we cannot trust each other. And I think many of us are wrestling with an even deeper question, which is, how do we trust each other? How do we navigate these choppy waters? How do we create the kind of world we want to live in? Work which necessitates vulnerability and being in relationship with not just ourselves, but with many people and beings outside of ourselves. How do we open to trust in a time where trust feels like a liability? In her book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, author and organizer Adrienne Marie Brown outlines 9 principles of what she calls emergent strategy. She describes emergence as the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. Brown writes that emergence is a way of speaking about the connective tissue of all that exists, that it emphasizes critical connections over critical mass, building authentic relationships, and listening with all senses of the body and the mind. I think there is much in her definition of emergence that resonates with our UU values. If it's a way about speaking of the connected nature of reality, that sounds similar to the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. I could probably preach a whole series of sermons on emergent strategy and its principles. And today I just want to invite us to consider one of them, the seventh, which is moving at the speed of trust. Move at the speed of trust, Brown says. Focus on critical connections more than critical mass. Build the resilience by building relationships. This principle points us in a direction that can feel counterintuitive. When we're in the midst of times like these, we can want to retreat. We can be tempted to put up defenses and isolate because it is just not worth it to risk being hurt. And Brown suggests the power of large-scale systemic change starts with us and our relationships. She says that what we practice at the small scale sets the patterns for the whole system. Brown's own mentor, the activist Grace Lee Boggs, taught her the maxim, transform yourself to transform the world. Transform yourself to transform the world. Brown writes that transforming the self doesn't mean getting lost in the self, but rather seeing our own lives and work and relationships as a front line, a first place we can practice justice, liberation, and alignment with each other and the planet. Adrienne Maree Brown points us to 6 practices for nurturing emergence and being in this kind of relationship. They are curiosity, vulnerable reflection, being present and intentional, pattern disrupting, self-transformation, and co-evolution through friendship. And I want to invite us to just briefly consider the first 4 of these and then spend a little more time with the last 2. To move at the speed of trust, we need curiosity. To cultivate curiosity means admitting to ourselves there are things we don't know and understand. It means remaining open to new ideas and change, greeting that which is new or different, or unusual or downright strange, with attentiveness rather than judgment. Vulnerable reflection. I believe vulnerable reflection is an extension of curiosity. It is to be accountable to ourselves and others, to truly acknowledge what is arising in our minds, bodies, and spirits, to cultivate an understanding of what it means when we're on the boat and feel misgivings about jumping into the waters, and trust our guts. It's to admit when our ideas and habits have constricted rather than liberated, to understand when it's time for change. So that's curiosity and vulnerable reflection. Next is being present and intentional. This invites us, I think, to remember, as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, that the present moment is the moment where our lives happen. To move with mindfulness and align our thought patterns with our values, living lives with purpose. Next comes pattern disrupting. This practice invites us to use the awareness cultivated through curiosity, vulnerable reflection, and being present and intentional to observe and interrupt patterns that undermine our worth and dignity and relationship with the interdependent web of life. It's about questioning what got us onto that boat in the choppy waters in the first place and asking what we can do about the situation and what support we need in order to do it. It invites us to free our imaginations and replace oppressive paradigms with radical possibility. That's pattern disrupting. And then we get to the place that I want to spend just a little more time. Self-transformation and co-evolution through friendship. These both involve building critical connections. We must form sustaining connections with ourselves and each other to transform ourselves and the world. So how do we do that? And what does it have to do with us being here this morning in a UU worship service? For one thing, I believe spiritual practices are at the heart of self-understanding and self-transformation. Spiritual practices offer us a space to reflect on our values and to integrate the things that matter most to us into our lives. They offer us a means to return to ourselves and our values when we stray from the path. I often say that to be a spiritual practitioner means being in connection with that which is beyond us in order to connect with us and our deepest selves. In addition to being individual practices, spiritual practices are also collective endeavors. It matters that we're here in this community where we practice together, where we sing together, read together, share joys and concerns, and encourage each other to live out our values. To do all this, we have to be in relationship with one another. To be in true relationship, we have to practice vulnerability. We have to be willing to open up to each other, to actually share our joys and our sorrows, our uncertainties and hopes and fears and dreams. We're called to be in relationship when it's easy and when it's hard, when we get along and when we annoy the daylights out of each other. When I was floundering in those waters and Alex came up to me, I did have a profound experience moving at the speed of trust. And something I didn't mention earlier is that I was also deeply annoyed, which may seem counterintuitive. But I was exhausted and irked by the idea of having to work to get back to that boat. There was a part of me that resented being given instructions in how to swim when it would be easier to just give up and not have to fight anymore. I felt vulnerable and irritable and not terribly likable. But we got through it together, moving at the speed of trust. So I want to ask, is anyone here annoyed right now about anything? Yeah. Exhausted maybe? On edge and cranky even with people you like, who you know are moving in the direction you want to move? Disability justice author and activist Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinghe, she writes about the work of collective love and care. And her writings on disability, which I've quoted before, maybe even here, offer us wisdom for how we move in community with each other. She says many of us who are disabled are not particularly likable or popular. We, with our panic attacks, trauma, triggers, our need for fat seating or wheelchair access, our crankiness and inaccessibility, are seen as pains in the butt, not particularly cool or sexy or interesting. Ableism and poverty and racism mean many of us are indeed in bad moods. Psychic difference and neurodivergence also mean we may be blunt, depressed, or hard to deal with by the tenets of an ableist world. And I am still arguing for the radical notion that we deserved to be loved as we are, as is. When we reach for each other and make the most access possible, it is an act of revolutionary love. I believe that to move at the speed of trust, we need to practice this kind of revolutionary love, which means showing up when we don't like each other and when we aren't at our most likable, because we deserve a loving world. Showing up when it's really hard, listening to the most marginalized among us when they tell us the shape of the world that would be most supportive for them. It means when we notice the wind's whipping up and the water's getting choppy, we collectively strategize about how we chart a course. When we notice someone struggling to stay afloat, we show up for them, even if we don't like them. Moving at the speed of trust means that when we are struggling, we reach out and ask for support. It means experimenting with new ways of being with each other, maybe literally moving together, practicing breathing meditation or sacred dance or walking meditation. Moving at the speed of trust means maybe we try out new ways of running committee meetings, making decisions by consensus, or valuing process as much or more than product. Maybe it means we come to an awareness of our own optimal pace and bring that into the complex dance of integrating our optimal pace with the optimal pace of others. And finally, maybe moving at the speed of trust means we remind each other when it's time to slow down and rest. We need rest right now, more than ever. I think moving at the speed of trust means that together we look at the waters, we sound the depths and take stock of the weather. We're curious, vulnerable, reflective, present and intentional, disruptive of patterns that don't serve us well, and self-transformative. We ask whether we really need to be getting in the water with those whales that don't seem to want to chill with us at our optimal pace. We ask whether the way we do things on this boat is actually just and loving. We co-evolve through friendship. We don't leave each other behind. And together, we chart a way through the waves. Amen. Selah, blessed be. May it be so. May we chart a way through the waves together.